Hello and welcome to the Workwise for Screen podcast, created to help our screen industries better look after all the people their businesses depend on.
And stay on safe legal ground. It's part of a growing collection of practical resources and guidance that you can dip into without it taking you forever or costing you anything. It's supported by the BFI, awarding national lottery funding.
We'll be talking with people across production, distribution and exhibition, animation, VFX and gaming about the challenges to well-being we face when deadlines and budgets are tight, and how, most importantly, to improve things. We are your hosts, Tacita Small from the Small HR Company, the HR for Entertainment one,
and Keith Arrowsmith, the legal one, a creative industries solicitor and programme director for Workwise for Screen.
Welcome to the Workwise for Screen podcast. In this episode, we're exploring relationships at work and the complications that arise when friends work together. Building a new startup with people you know can be hugely exciting, but once you create a business together, you go from being friends to being co-workers. This changes the dynamic of the relationship, and without clear guidelines, it can lead to miscommunication and a difference in expectations. It can also have implications for new people joining the team who weren't there at the start. As ever, we don't know every listener's specific circumstances, so we can only provide general guidance to introduce this subject. You may need to talk through your situation with a specialist before making any final decisions.
So what we've got today is a guest called David White, and he's been through this process. So David is the People and Culture Manager at Junkfish. They're an independent games development studio. They've been going since 2013, and they launched their first game in 2015. And 10 years after it started, he's helped them make sure that Junkfish can move from being a group of friends into a business that has 50 employees. Let's go back to the formation of Junkfish, because when you arrived, it was existing. So how did it feel joining an existing team?
They were definitely so open to having an HR influence. I think because they'd went quite a long time with limited scope in that area, they were really excited.
What was that like for you going into what is essentially, at 10 years, a startup?
Yeah, really, really interesting. And it just almost felt like I had a blank canvas to work with. That was a really, really exciting opportunity for me to be like, I can shape this. We can define all of that, all of these things and items that have gone undefined for the length of time that they have. We can start to put names to them. We can start to put policies behind them. We can start to put processes to them.
And what about, working within an organisation that was set up by a group of friends? So you're not part of that original setup there, and you're joining 10 years in, but I'm imagining that a lot of the originals were still there and the friends that began that. What was that experience like for you?
With it initially starting just as a group of friends straight out of university, it's something that had for a long time, that is what it had been, and it was fun and it was engaging. To then have to instill expectation, professional maturities, things like that. What's important is to try and bring those key factors forward to allow that to influence the more bureaucratic elements of HR. Within startups, what you typically find is you do have a lot of people wearing multiple hats, and sometimes that overreaches to other areas, other departments. So how do we scope that properly defines what each department does, what each role is responsible for, and so everybody understands essentially where they stand. So that one of the biggest exercises that I did when I first started was, let's define your mission, vision, and values, and let's define your organisational identity. Because that wasn't really something that was there prior to my arrival. It was something I think that a lot of people had talked about in passing, but not really essentially put the pen to paper. That then allowed me to essentially carry out a research project, which was speaking to every member of the team individually, and essentially asking, so what is it about this company that's important to you? Why are you still here? And where do you want to see it go? That gave so much data, so much information, that outside of just the very welcoming greeting that I got, I gleaned so much information from people that way that told me exactly where the company was, who the people were, what was important to them, that I then got to use that to inform, these are our values. These are what you've told us that you want, how you see your company. It's almost like translating English to English a little bit, where we take kind of what's been told of us of the original vision of the company and modernize it because it has scaled up, because the ambitions have grown, because the reality is the company did grow. And by the time I joined, it was bigger than just the original people that started it. And I think the original people that started it did recognise that there was value that was getting brought with every new person that joined. It was something that they definitely were on board with regards to how do we move, rather than moving it from focusing on a small group of people to individuals on a wider scale. That was something that was actively driven by them.
It sounds as though you were working with a group of friends who were able to bring a kind of sense of, well, self-awareness about where their strengths laid and the kind of support they needed in order to help run the business in its next chapter with a much larger team. And that takes, that takes something, doesn't it? Where there's a risk that you have to set your friendships aside in order to do the right thing for the organization, for the business. Kind of how do you help people make those changes as the life of the business goes on?
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. And I think you've really raised a good point there with pointing out the self-awareness. I think the team were already at a stage of almost willing to see the company transform and succeed in a way that did value the individual. They were already there by the time I got there. And it was just about helping them along the way, putting in the processes to allow them to do that. Where that then creates work, I would say, is how do you manage things like bias? How do you manage things like proper processes for performance, proper processes for attendance, proper processes for all these different types of things that suddenly, oh, I have these things to report. I have to do an annual review for somebody. I have to have this meeting about performance, or I have to be discussed with regard that there's maybe a disciplinary that I need to be involved in. Those are types of things that perhaps wasn't necessarily on the radar before, and now they're all coming in. So that's those areas where you have to kind of essentially build the company up to be able to operate at a more professional level and factoring those things in. I think especially the bias one's a big one. And it's not something that's necessarily is something that you see very often or something that is exemplified by the company itself, but it is something that you need to be aware of when you're working with people that have a pre-existing interpersonal relationship, especially when it's across levels of seniority. So one of the things, as I say, about defining the values, about defining the identity, is defining the structure and defining who's in charge, defining who reports into who. And a lot of the times there's no getting away from the fact that you might have a line manager who is best friends with one of their team members. So how do you manage that? And
this is so common. Like this, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but this is so common in the creative industries. So you have a group of friends that set something up, whether it be in gaming, in television, in film, in anything. Could get creative agencies, and it's kind of like we're great at this. Let's do a business. Yay, we're amazing and successful. But no, who's in charge? Who's in charge of the money? Who's in charge of the performance? Who's in charge of the decisions? Who has the final yes or no? When you talk about defining, I love that definition and using that. I should have like a little plaque saying definition.
definition, and
yeah.
reiteration.
I like that. Yeah.
It's one of the key things that I tell my managers is, see if you've said something once, you can say it 50 more times.
Yeah, I love it.
You can't give advice enough. So one of the things I'll probably segue a little bit into is behaviours. So how do you train good behaviours? How do you encourage good behaviours? And how do you make sure that that becomes a standard? What we did is I developed off the back of the values project was a behavioural chat. So we break down behaviors into 7 key categories. So we have collaboration, communication, forward thinking, solutions driven, planning and organizing, organizational identity, and development. Within each of those categories, you have examples of what good behaviors look like and what bad behaviors look like and how each influence the business. We call them multipliers and diminishers. So within that, you have essentially a scale of, if you're an employee, here's what's expected of you. If you're a manager, here's what's expected of you. If you're a senior manager, here's what's expected of you. With the understanding that even at the top end, you still have the responsibility and the expectation of all those other levels that come before it. And it was about clearly defining different examples of, you're helping us when you do this, you're helping yourself when you do this, but actually you might create conflict if you do this, or you might create disruption if you do this. For example, multiplier under solutions driven heading would be like that you assume responsibility for problems, you work with others to resolve problems, you come to a conclusion. With the example diminisher related to that would be blaming others when problems arise and the impact that that has. So putting that in, it gives you something to refer back to. And this is why it's important when I talk about building infrastructure. Building policy, building guidance is all about having something that essentially you can use to essentially communicate things more effectively. So if there is behavioural issues, you can actually refer, let's go back and look at this chart. Here's where this falls under. Here's what the expectation is. Here's what less helpful behaviours look like. And you can point out directly where a person might be sitting in that. And you can then create tangible goals and tangible action points, which would improve that.
How do you deal with maybe embedding that really, I suppose, because it's great to have all these things going on, but when you're maybe a new person coming in to help with this stuff and you're dealing with legacy and shorthand and reversion to the way we used to do it before, was that a challenge at all, or is that an ongoing challenge?
A little bit. I think what I saw was, and you might have experience of this yourself, Tacita, is that when you are giving the kind of theoretical overview or the theoretical deployment, people are on board at that point because it all sounds great and it all sounds like a good idea on paper. It's when it comes to the practical implication that you might face challenges, because suddenly people have to change the way they worked to what they've been used to. Suddenly there's different expectations on them. It's about being able to understand where people's insecurities come from and originate. I always say, ask why 5 times. It's guidance that I give to managers, or if you're not going to ask it, at least think it. Probe, find out where those original insecurities are coming from and meet people where they're at. Listen to what worries that they have, because even though you are coming from a position of wanting to make things better, wanting to improve things tangibly, wanting to put process in and things like that, people can have valid concerns. There will be things that will affect their way of working that you might not have even considered. So it's important to meet people where they're at. It's important to take them seriously. It's important to actively listen. And for me, that's probably been the big gateway in building trust. And gaining trust and developing it and maintaining it is almost like the key to getting buy-in for new policies, new processes, that type of thing.
You've talked also about the reality for a small business is that lots of people wear lots of hats. Can you give us a tip or two on what we should look out for if we think that someone's wearing the wrong hat?
Yeah, I think the most common reason that I've came up against for that is actually where somebody had to perform duties of an undefined role because it didn't exist, and then that role was created and somebody else takes that role up. That's probably one of the most common things that I've seen. And how do you create those boundaries there? Because if somebody's had those responsibilities that they've done a great job in, how do you communicate that those responsibilities are now moving to another part of the business or another individual or another team? Again, I'm probably going to parrot myself a little bit here, but it is about meeting people where they're at and using the active listening tactic and making sure that you are hearing the kind of key insecurities that people might have a problem with if you're redefining that role, but also communicating that it's being redefined in the first place. Because I think what we can see sometimes is that people might not even have an awareness that if they are still carrying out duties, that it's an overreach or that it crosses a boundary. So it's just about communicating and defining the key aspects of what the role that they have now is and what that potential new role is and where those overlaps no longer exist.
If you're looking at a business that wants to take those first steps to help support new entrants, finding people outside of their original friendship group, what would your top tip for that group of people be?
So there's a couple of phases of this, with the first one being if you are recruiting for additional staff, and that's about, you're going to be sick of me saying this, again, defining who you are, your mission, vision, your values, your employer value proposition, what is great about you, what do you feel binds you together. And you need to define that, but you also need to define the type of people that you want to work with. And what are the key strengths that you feel your team has that you want to expand out on a wider scale. So it's about really taking the time to consider your identity as a group and what that means on a potentially wider scale, but also structuring what you expect from new people coming in. And I think that's where value-based interviewing is really helpful. I think the other side of it, again, is what I've discussed, is just making sure that boundaries, professional and otherwise, are clearly set, that the structure is in place for hierarchy, that is all planned in advance. You basically need to prepare for potentially a lot of problems. Not to say that necessarily you're going to face every one of them, but if you prepare for them all, you've got more likelihood of being able to enjoy and reap the rewards of a growing team. The biggest thing is that you're going to be responsible for more people. You're going to have legal responsibility for more people. And when it reaches a certain point, suddenly you're an organization with 40, 50 people that, you might not have the same capacity to engage with on a social or an interpersonal level that you do at the moment. And how do you translate that methodology? How do you translate that culture to a wider group of people? How do you make people feel included? How do you make people feel involved? There's always going to be surprises and there's always going to be outliers. Human beings are human beings. There are some things that you may find yourself in scenarios that you have to deal with that you might not have been able to prevent, but that's why you plan. And that's why you build your organisational structure before it scopes out to invite new people in.
That was such a great conversation with David just there, and listen to how he's joined an organisation year 10 when the business is still considered a startup. Being someone who's going to go in and help with process, with policy, but also help with defining behaviours, scoping out roles and putting in boundaries is quite a tough thing to do. But as business owners, for them to invite him in to do that, I think that's real. It shows real professional maturity. And that's what I got from a lot of what David was saying there, is when organizations have, or if you're like, start out with that professional maturity, the piece around friendship or know each other very well becomes a little easier because the roles become a bit more clear.
Yeah, I think you'd start in a position where it's the friendship that brings you into the room, but then you can't end up in a situation where it's the only thing that keeps you in the room. As leaders, we need to know our own strengths, but we also need to know our weaknesses and kind of be open to that kind of feedback to test whether we're still the right person to wear a particular hat or a particular role for our business. And it may be that life's moved on, or it might be the business has moved on, or it might just be society or the world has moved on. And we've got to get used to these kind of moments of change. And some of them are internal and some of them are external. And all of them are interesting, but we have to find ways of dealing with it. And if we've got a level of trust, then we've got a chance.
I think sometimes businesses always think about the communication externally, going out to the client, going out to people that are buying in the service or the product, as opposed to what that communication can look like internally. And when communication breaks down internally, it can be as difficult or easy to repair as you want it to be. Reviewing how you communicate with each other as a group of people who have an emotional tie as friends, setting up a business, is something to continually bring to the forefront of whatever it is you're doing.
We've got some resources on our website about how do you handle those difficult conversations at work. And I think that balance between making sure that you're doing the right thing for the business, but you're protecting the team is really difficult. So again, some resources to help with that. And also that kind of sense of making sure that we can look after people through that onboarding process. So it's not going to be as scary as perhaps it might seem at the beginning to bring in that expertise, to bring in that new resource from outside of your friendship group. So yeah, plenty to help people as they start thinking about that too. Thanks for listening to the Workwise for Screen podcast, supported by the BFI awarding National Lottery funding.
Our online platform provides lots of easy to understand information and invites to our events. Visit our website at workwiseforscreen.org.uk and register for the latest updates.
Please follow us on social media and join in this crucial conversation.
And contact us with suggestions for future episodes, or if you can, support the programme in any other way. This podcast is produced by 1860. Music is by Benjamin Squires.